The blizzard had been raging for 3 days when Leora found him. She'd ventured out into the white hell not from bravery, but from necessity. Her generator had failed, and without the backup fuel stored in the shed, she'd freeze before dawn. The wind howled like something alive and hungry, tearing at her coat as she struggled through snow that reached her thighs. Each step forward was a battle, each breath a knife of ice in her lungs. She almost missed him entirely. The dark shape against the white was so still, she mistook it for a fallen log at first. But logs didn't bleed, and they didn't have the sleek, powerful lines of a wolf larger than any she'd ever seen. He lay crumpled against the base of an ancient pine, his dark fur matted with blood and snow, ribs rising and falling in the shallow rhythm of approaching death. Leora had learned long ago that survival meant making hard choices. The smart thing would be to leave him. Wolves were dangerous even when healthy, and she was barely managing to keep herself alive in this remote cabin, without taking on the burden of nursing a wild predator back to health. But as she stared down at the magnificent creature, something in her chest twisted painfully. She'd been alone for so long that even the company of a dying wolf seemed precious. And there was something about him, the intelligence in his amber eyes as they flickered open, the way he didn't snarl or snap despite his obvious pain, that made walking away feel like abandoning something irreplaceable. "You're too big for me to carry," she told him, her voice barely audible over the wind. "But if you can make it to my cabin, I'll do what I can." The wolf's gaze fixed on hers with an intensity that should have been impossible for a wild animal. For a moment that stretched longer than logic allowed, she felt as though he was seeing not just her face, but something deeper, something that recognized her in return. Then he struggled to his feet, swaying with exhaustion and blood loss, and began following her through the storm. The journey back to her cabin was a nightmare of endurance. The wolf, she found herself thinking of him as him, rather than it, though she couldn't say why, stumbled several times, and each time she had to coax him back to his feet with words and touches that should have resulted in her being mauled. Instead, he seemed to draw strength from her presence, pushing forward when she was certain he had nothing left to give. By the time they reached her door, they were both shaking from cold and exhaustion. Leora managed to get him inside and onto the thick rug in front of her fireplace, where the light revealed the true extent of his injuries. Deep gashes across his ribs, a wound on his shoulder that looked like it had come from claws the size of daggers, and burns along his back that suggested he'd encountered something far more dangerous than another wolf. "What happened to you?" she whispered, gently cleaning the worst of the wounds with warm water and antiseptic. "What could do this to something your size?" The wolf's amber eyes tracked her movements with an awareness that made her skin prickle. She'd worked with animals before. Her late father had been a veterinarian, and she'd learned field medicine from necessity, but she'd never encountered anything that seemed so present, so conscious of her every word and gesture. As she worked, cleaning and bandaging wounds that should have been fatal, Leora found herself talking to him, about the storm, about her isolated life, about the loneliness that had become such a constant companion she'd almost forgotten what human connection felt like. The wolf listened with an attention that felt almost like conversation, his breathing gradually steadying as her ministrations took effect. "You're going to live," she told him as she finished with the last bandage. "I don't know how, but you're stronger than anything that tried to kill you." The wolf's response was to shift closer to her, his massive head coming to rest against her thigh, with a trust that should have been terrifying, but somehow felt like the most natural thing in the world. 3 days later, when the storm finally broke, Leora woke to find her patient gone. No sign of his presence except the lingering scent of pine and something wilder, and the inexplicable certainty that her life had just changed in ways she couldn't begin to understand. She had no way of knowing that 50 miles away, in a fortress carved from black stone and ancient power, the heir to a brutal throne was fighting for consciousness while his father paced like a caged predator, and his court waited to see whether their future would survive the night. She had no way of knowing that when Cale Reveren's fever finally broke, the first word he spoke was her name, a name he'd never heard, but somehow knew with the certainty of recognition that transcended logic. She had no way of knowing that by saving a dying wolf, she'd set in motion events that would bring the most feared alpha king in the Northern Territories to his knees and transform a kingdom built on brutality into something unprecedented. All she knew was that for 3 days she hadn't been alone, and now that the cabin was empty again, The silence felt like mourning for something she'd never had the chance to fully understand. But in the obsidian halls of the Raverin fortress, understanding was coming whether she was ready for it or not. Before we begin, remember to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Every day, a new story awaits you. Now, let us begin. The Raverin fortress rose from the mountainside like a scar carved in black stone, its towers piercing the sky with the arrogance of something that had never known defeat. Within its walls, power moved like a living thing, ancient, hungry, and absolutely ruthless in its pursuit of dominance. Kael Ravarin had been unconscious for 6 days. Alpha King Thane. Ravarin stood beside his son's bed, his massive frame rigid with the kind of controlled fury that had built an empire from the bones of his enemies. At 6.5 feet tall, with silver threading through black hair and scars that mapped decades of brutal victories, Thane commanded respect through presence alone. When he was angry, the very air seemed to thicken with threat. He was beyond angry now. He was volcanic. "Explain to me again," he said, his voice carrying the deadly quiet that preceded executions, "how my heir, the future of this bloodline, ended up alone in a blizzard with injuries that should have been fatal." The 3 pack members who had accompanied Kael on what should have been a routine border patrol shifted uncomfortably. Marcus, the lead warrior, bore fresh claw marks across his face that spoke of recent battle. His companions, twin brothers named Dex and Finn, looked like they'd rather face armed rebels than their alpha's current mood. "The rogues were waiting for us," Marcus said carefully. "Not random scavengers, organized fighters with weapons designed specifically to kill our kind. Silver-edged blades, fire bombs that burned even after they hit. Someone had trained them, given them intelligence about our patrol routes. And you left my son behind." The words dropped into the chamber like stones into still water, sending ripples of tension through everyone present. Dr. Elena Voss, the pack's chief physician and one of the few people brave enough to stand up to Thane when circumstances demanded it, cleared her throat softly. "They followed protocol," she said, not looking up from the medical charts she was reviewing. "When the heir is compromised, the priority is preventing capture that could be used for political leverage. They made the tactically correct decision. The tactically correct decision left my son dying in a snowstorm. The tactically correct decision ensured he wasn't taken alive by enemies who would have used him to destroy everything you've built." Dr. Voss finally met Thane's gaze, her expression professionally calm, despite the waves of lethal authority radiating from the Alpha King. "Sometimes survival requires accepting terrible costs." Thane was quiet for a long moment, his attention shifting to the still form on the bed. Kael looked younger than his 28 years, the harsh lines of command smoothed by unconsciousness. But even in his weakened state, he radiated the same predatory power that marked all the Raverin bloodline, the genetic legacy of wolves bred for dominance across 17 generations. "His injuries," Thane said finally. "The pattern suggests something beyond random violence." "I agree, Dr. Purr." Voss moved to Kael's side, checking his vital signs with the efficiency of someone who had learned medicine under battlefield conditions. The precision of the wounds, the specific targeting of major blood vessels, whoever did this knew exactly how to disable a shifter without killing him immediately. Torture? Information extraction. They wanted him alive long enough to talk. She gestured toward partially healed burns along Kael's ribs. "These are interrogation wounds, designed to cause maximum pain without causing death." The implications settled over the room like a death shroud. An organized attack specifically targeting the heir, using weapons and techniques that suggested intimate knowledge of shifter physiology. Someone hadn't just tried to kill Kael, they'd tried to break him. "Who found him?" Thane asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer wouldn't satisfy him. "We don't know." Marcus shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable with admitting ignorance. "When we circled back to search for his body, he was already gone. No tracks, no scent trail to follow, like someone had simply erased all evidence of what happened. People don't just disappear, Marcus, especially not my heir. No, Your Majesty, but..." The conversation stopped abruptly, as a soft groan emerged from the bed. Every pair of eyes in the room snapped to Kael as his eyelids fluttered, consciousness returning with the gradual intensity of sunrise after endless night. "Kael?" Thane was beside the bed instantly, his earlier fury transforming into concern so profound it was almost painful to witness. "Son, can you hear me?" Kale's amber eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, then sharpening as awareness returned. When he tried to speak, his voice emerged as barely more than a whisper. "She saved me." "Who saved you?" "Doctor." Voss leaned forward, medical curiosity overriding protocol. "Kale, we need to understand what happened. Can you tell us where you were? Who helped you?" "Human." The word emerged with effort, but with absolute certainty. "Human woman, living alone. He struggled to sit up, wincing as healing wounds protested the movement. "She found me during the storm, brought me to her cabin, treated my injuries." Thane's expression darkened. "A human treated shifter wounds and you survived? That's impossible. Human medicine can't—" She knew what she was doing. Kale's voice was gaining strength, though it still carried the roughness of recent trauma. "Veterinary training," she said. "Lost her father, living in isolation." His eyes grew distant, as if seeing something beyond the stone walls surrounding them. "She saved my life when she could have left me to die." "Where?" The question emerged from Thane with the force of a command that could compel truth from stone. "Where is this cabin?" Kyle frowned, clearly struggling with memory that seemed fragmented. "North of the border territories, maybe 20 miles from the old mining station." She called the area Whitewater Ridge. Marcus and his companions exchanged glances that spoke of familiarity with the location. "That's deep wilderness," Marcus said carefully. "No registered settlements, no packed territories. What would a human be doing living alone in that kind of isolation?" "Running from something," Dr. Voss said pragmatically. "Or hiding from someone. People don't choose that level of isolation without powerful reasons." Before anyone could respond, the chamber door opened to admit Counselor Aldrich Dorn, Thane's chief political advisor and one of the most calculating minds in the Northern Territories. Tall, lean, and silver-haired, Aldrich moved with the predatory grace of someone who had survived 3 decades in pack politics through intelligence rather than brute strength. "Your Majesty," he said with a slight bow, his pale eyes cataloging the tension in the room with uncomfortable accuracy. "I trust the heir's recovery is progressing well?" "He's conscious," Thane replied curtly, "and providing information about his rescue that raises more questions than it answers." "Ah," Aldrich's expression sharpened with interest. "May I inquire as to the nature of these questions?" As Thane summarized Kale's account of being rescued by an isolated human woman, Aldrich's frown deepened with obvious concern. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "if I may suggest caution in how this information is handled. A human with knowledge of the heir's location and condition represents a significant security risk." "She saved his life," Kale protested, struggling to sit up straighter despite Dr. Voss's attempts to keep him horizontal. "Without her intervention, I would have died in that storm." "Which we appreciate, of course. But gratitude doesn't negate the security implications of a human possessing sensitive information about our family's vulnerabilities." The words hung in the air with implications that made Kale's blood run cold. "You're suggesting we silence her." "I'm suggesting we evaluate the threat she represents and respond accordingly." Aldrich's tone was perfectly reasonable, which somehow made his words more chilling than open hostility would have been. "Standard protocol when outsiders gain access to information that could compromise pack security. She's not a threat." Kyle's voice carried a note of authority that surprised everyone present, including himself. "She had every opportunity to harm me when I was unconscious and defenseless. Instead, she risked her own safety to keep me alive. Past actions don't guarantee future loyalty," Aldrich replied smoothly, "particularly when political circumstances change. What happens when our enemies discover that a human possesses intimate knowledge of the heir's weaknesses? How long before she becomes a target for information extraction or leverage?" Thane was quiet during this exchange, his attention shifting between his son and his advisor, with the calculating intensity of someone weighing competing priorities. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of decision that would reshape multiple lives. "We need to assess the situation directly," he said finally, "which means we need to find this woman and evaluate the security implications of her knowledge." "And if she proves to be a threat?" Aldrich asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Then we handle the threat according to pack law." The finality in Thane's voice made clear exactly what handling would entail. In the world of shifter politics, threats were eliminated, not negotiated with. "No." The word emerged from Kyle with surprising force, causing every head in the room to turn toward him. "I won't allow harm to come to someone who saved my life. I don't care what pack law dictates." You don't have a choice in this matter, Thane replied, his tone carrying paternal authority backed by absolute power. Your safety and the security of our territory take precedence over personal gratitude. My safety was secured by her actions. Without her intervention, there would be no heir to protect. And without proper security protocols, there may not be an heir to inherit. Thane's expression hardened into the mask of command that had crushed rebellions and brought rival packs to their knees. This discussion is finished. We'll locate the woman, assess the threat, and respond accordingly. Then I'm coming with you. You're barely conscious and still healing from injuries that nearly killed you. You're not going anywhere. Cale met his father's gaze with determination that echoed Thane's own legendary stubbornness. She's under my protection. As heir to this pack, I claim right of safeguard for someone who preserved the continuity of our bloodline. The claim of safeguard was ancient pack law, rarely invoked, but impossible to ignore when formally declared. It placed the protected individual under the heir's personal authority, making any harm against them equivalent to an attack on the royal family itself. Silence filled the chamber, as everyone present processed the implications of what Cale had just done. By invoking safeguard, he'd essentially declared the unknown human woman to be under royal protection, a status that carried both immense privilege and dangerous responsibility. You're making a mistake, Aldrich said quietly. Political protection based on personal gratitude rarely ends well for anyone involved. Then I'll live with the consequences of my mistake. Cale's voice was steady despite the physical effort of remaining upright. But I won't live with the consequences of allowing harm to come to someone who showed mercy when she could have chosen otherwise. Thane studied his son for a long moment, seeing something in Cale's expression that seemed to surprise him. This matters to you. More than standard gratitude would explain. Yes. Why? Cale was quiet for a moment, his amber eyes growing distant, as if accessing memories that were both precious and confusing. Because for 3 days, someone cared whether I lived or died, without knowing who I was or what I represented. She helped me because I needed help, not because it would advance her position or increase her influence. His gaze met his father's directly. When was the last time either of us experienced that kind of uncomplicated compassion? The question hit its target with devastating accuracy. Thane, who had lived his entire adult life surrounded by people who wanted something from him, whose every interaction was colored by political calculation or fear, felt something twist in his chest at his son's words. Very well, he said finally. The woman remains under your protection, but we will evaluate the security situation, and we will take appropriate measures to ensure that protection doesn't compromise pack safety. Understood. And you will recover fully before involving yourself in any aspect of the situation. Father, that wasn't a request, Cale. It was a direct order from your alpha. Thane's tone brooked no argument. You'll heal, you'll regain your strength, and then we'll discuss how to handle this situation without creating additional security vulnerabilities. As the various advisors and warriors filed out of the chamber, leaving Cale alone with Dr. Voss for continued medical monitoring, none of them suspected that the situation had already moved far beyond their control. Because 50 miles north, in a cabin surrounded by wilderness and silence, Leora Hale was experiencing dreams that shouldn't have been possible. Vivid, detailed visions of amber eyes, and a voice that called her name with desperate recognition. She had no way of knowing that the wolf she'd saved was fighting for the right to protect her in return. She had no way of knowing that her simple act of mercy had set in motion political forces that would either elevate her beyond anything she could imagine or destroy her before she understood what she'd become part of. All she knew was that something was calling to her from the darkness beyond her doorstep, and that ignoring that call was becoming more impossible with each passing hour. Leora Hale had lived alone for 2 years, but she'd never felt truly isolated until the morning she woke to find her dreams filled with amber eyes and a voice speaking her name in languages she didn't recognize. She stood at her kitchen window, nursing coffee that had gone cold while she stared at the tree line where she'd found the wounded wolf a week ago. The logical part of her mind insisted she'd imagined the intelligence in those golden eyes, the almost human awareness that had made caring for him feel like tending to a person rather than an animal. The rest of her mind whispered that logic had nothing to do with what she'd experienced. You're losing it, Leora, she muttered, forcing herself to turn away from the window. 3 days with a hurt animal, and now you're having mystical experiences. Next you'll be seeing fairy rings and hearing voices in the wind. But even as she spoke the words, she knew they rang hollow. What she'd felt during those 3 days hadn't been simple compassion for an injured creature. It had been recognition, the bone-deep certainty that she was looking at someone rather than something, someone who knew her in ways that transcended their brief encounter. The sound of engines approaching through the forest cut through her brooding like a blade through silk. Leora froze, coffee mug halfway to her lips, as the mechanical growl grew louder and more distinct. Multiple vehicles, moving with the confident speed of people who knew exactly where they were going. She lived 20 miles from the nearest road, 30 miles from the nearest neighbor. No one had any reason to visit her isolated cabin unless they were lost, desperate, or hunting for something specific. None of those options promised pleasant outcomes. Leora moved quickly through her small home, checking the locks on doors and windows while her mind raced through possibilities. Government officials investigating illegal residents on federal land. Criminals using her isolation for activities they wanted to keep private. Worse possibilities that her father's paranoid warnings had prepared her to consider. The engine stopped just beyond the clearing that surrounded her cabin, but she could hear car doors slamming and voices speaking in tones too low for her to decipher words. Through her front window, she caught glimpses of movement between the trees, at least 6 figures approaching with the coordinated precision of people accustomed to working as a team. When the knock came at her front door, it was firm, but not aggressive, professional rather than threatening, though Leora's experience had taught her that professional people could be far more dangerous than obvious predators. "Ms. Hale?" The voice was male, carrying an accent she couldn't place but speaking with the kind of authority that expected to be obeyed. "We'd like to speak with you about a situation that occurred in this area recently." Leora remained silent, her hand resting on the hunting rifle her father had taught her to use when she was 12. Through the window, she could see 2 men flanking her front door, both tall, powerfully built, and moving with a predatory grace that set every survival instinct screaming. "We're not here to harm you," the voice continued. "We're investigating an incident involving someone who may have been injured during the recent storm. We believe you may have information that could help us locate him. Him, not it." They weren't looking for an animal. They were looking for a person, which meant either she'd been right about the intelligence she'd sensed in those amber eyes, or she was dealing with people who had very different information about what she'd found in the forest. "I don't know what you're talking about," she called through the door, keeping her voice steady despite the way her pulse was racing. "I haven't seen anyone in this area for weeks." A pause, filled with the kind of consultation that suggested the people outside were communicating in ways she couldn't detect. Then the voice spoke again, and this time there was something different about its tone. Less official, more personal. "Ms. Hale, my name is Kale. I believe you saved my life 6 days ago, during the blizzard. I'd like the opportunity to thank you properly." The words hit her like cold water, washing away every rational explanation she'd constructed for her recent experiences. The voice was different, rougher, more tired, but unmistakably familiar. She'd heard it in her dreams every night since the wolf had disappeared, calling her name with desperate recognition. "That's impossible," she whispered, though she was already moving toward the door. "I know how it sounds, but you found me bleeding in the snow near the old pine at the eastern edge of your property. You brought me to your cabin, cleaned my wounds, kept me alive for 3 days." The voice grew closer to the door, and Leora could hear the exhaustion beneath its careful control. "You told me about your father's veterinary practice, about choosing to live alone after losing him. You saved my life when you could have left me to die." Each detail was accurate, but they were details she'd shared with a wounded wolf, not a human being, which meant either the man outside possessed impossible knowledge, or she was dealing with something far beyond her understanding of how the world worked. "Prove it," she said, her hand still resting on the rifle, but no longer gripping it like a weapon. "The first night, you fell asleep in the chair beside the fireplace because you were afraid to leave me alone. When you woke up, I was closer to you than when you'd fallen asleep." His voice carried a warmth that made something in her chest tighten with recognition. "You said it was probably just unconscious movement, but you seemed pleased that I'd trusted you enough to move closer." The memory was perfect in every detail, including the flutter of happiness she'd felt at what she'd interpreted as the wolf beginning to trust her. No one else could have known about that moment because no one else had been there, except apparently, they had been. Leora's hand shook as she unlocked the front door, pulling it open to reveal 6 people standing in her front yard, with the coordinated alertness of a military unit. But her attention fixed immediately on the man standing closest to her door, and her breath caught in her throat as recognition slammed through her like lightning. He was tall, at least 6.5 feet, with dark hair and skin that looked like it had been carved from golden marble. His clothes were expensive but practical, designed for someone who needed to move quickly if circumstances required it. But it was his eyes that stopped her heart. Amber gold, ancient and intelligent, exactly like the eyes that had watched her with impossible awareness, while she'd tended to wounds that should have been fatal. "Hello, Leora," he said softly, and the voice was definitely the same one that had been calling her name in dreams she couldn't shake. "You're not human," she said, surprised by how calm her own voice sounded, despite the way her entire understanding of reality was currently reshaping itself. "No, I'm not." His smile was slight, but genuine, carrying warmth that eased some of the terror that should have been paralyzing her. "I'm what your folklore would call a werewolf, though the reality is more complex than the stories suggest." "Shapeshifter," she said, the word emerging from some part of her mind that was apparently less shocked by impossible revelations than the rest of her. "That's why you felt so present when I was taking care of you. You were conscious the entire time. Every moment." His amber eyes held depths that seemed to strip away every defense she'd thought she possessed. Every kindness, every gentle word, every moment when you chose to help, rather than protect yourself from potential danger. The weight of what he was saying began to settle over her like a heavy blanket. She'd spent 3 days caring for someone who had been aware of her every action, her every word, her every unguarded moment of compassion. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. "Why let me think you were just an animal?" "Because I was dying, and shifting back to human form would have accelerated that process." His expression grew more serious. "And because I needed to understand who you were before revealing what I was. Humans and our kind don't typically interact peacefully." "Our kind?" Leora's attention shifted to the other 5 people watching their exchange with varying degrees of interest and wariness. Now that she knew what to look for, the predatory grace that marked all of them became unmistakable. "You're all shifters, yes. My father's inner circle, here to ensure that your knowledge of my identity doesn't create security complications for our people." The casual way he mentioned security complications sent ice through Leora's veins. "What kind of complications?" Before Kale could answer, one of the other men stepped forward, older than Kale, with silver threading through black hair and scars that spoke of battles won through brutality rather than skill. When he spoke, his voice carried an authority that seemed to make the air itself defer to his presence. "The kind that arise when humans possess information that could be used against us by our enemies," he said, his tone perfectly reasonable despite the underlying threat. "You've seen my son in his most vulnerable state, treated wounds that revealed the extent of our physical capabilities, and now possess knowledge of our true nature. That makes you either a valuable ally or a significant threat. Father." Kale's voice carried a warning that suggested family dynamics more complex than simple parent-child relationships. "We discussed this. We discussed your desire to protect someone who showed you kindness. We didn't discuss the practical realities of managing security in situations like this." The older man's attention fixed on Leora with uncomfortable intensity. "I'm Thane Reverin, Alpha King of the Northern Territories, and you, Ms. Hale, represent a problem that needs to be solved. Alpha King." The title hit Leora like a physical blow, as she realized exactly who she was dealing with. She'd heard stories about the Reverin pack, whispered legends about wolves who ruled through fear and controlled territory that stretched across 3 states. They were the monsters parents used to frighten children, the predators that even other predators feared. And she'd been unknowingly nursing the heir to their throne back to health. "What kind of solution are you considering?" she asked, proud that her voice remained steady despite the way terror was flooding her system. "That depends on several factors," Thane replied. "Your intentions regarding the information you now possess, your willingness to accept certain restrictions on your freedom of movement and communication, your ability to understand that betraying our trust would have consequences that extend beyond personal harm. You're threatening me. I'm explaining reality." Thane's expression remained perfectly calm, which somehow made his words more terrifying than open hostility would have been. "Knowledge is power, Ms. Hale, and power in the wrong hands destroys lives." "I don't want power," Leora said quickly. "I never asked to know about any of this. I just wanted to help someone who was hurt, and that help is appreciated," a new voice said. A woman stepped forward from the group, tall, elegant, with silver-streaked hair and intelligent dark eyes. But appreciation doesn't negate the need for practical security measures. I'm Dr. Elena Voss, chief physician to the royal family. May I say that your medical care almost certainly saved the heir's life? Almost certainly? His injuries were severe enough that conventional treatment would have been insufficient. The fact that you were able to stabilize him long enough for his natural healing to take effect demonstrates both skill and dedication that went far beyond minimal humanitarian assistance. The praise should have been gratifying, but it felt like a lead-up to something she wasn't going to enjoy hearing. However, Dr. Voss continued, confirming Leora's suspicions, your knowledge of shifter physiology, healing rates, and vulnerabilities could be extremely valuable to anyone seeking to harm our people. We need assurance that such knowledge won't be misused. What kind of assurance? The kind that involves accepting our protection while we evaluate the long-term implications of this situation, Thane said. You'll come with us. Remain in secure accommodations while we determine the best way to handle your unique position. You mean you're kidnapping me? We're offering you safety while we resolve a complex situation. Thane's smile was sharp with predatory satisfaction. The alternative would be leaving you here to face whatever enemies tried to kill my son when they discover that a witness to their failure still exists. The words hit like ice water, washing away her focus on immediate threats, and replacing it with awareness of dangers she hadn't considered. If Kale had been attacked by organized enemies, those same enemies might see her as a source of information about his condition, his location, his vulnerabilities. I didn't think about that, she admitted. Most humans don't think in terms of political consequences, Thane replied, though his tone suggested this was a failing rather than a reasonable limitation. Which is why decisions about your safety are better left to people who understand the full scope of what you've become involved in. And if I refuse to come with you? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Leora could feel the tension ratcheting up among the shifters surrounding her. This was clearly the moment where cooperation ended and coercion began. You won't refuse, Kale said quietly, his amber eyes meeting hers with intensity that made her pulse quicken. Because you're too intelligent not to understand that your life changed the moment you chose to save mine. The only question now is whether that change leads to safety or tragedy. For me or for you? For both of us. His smile was slight but carried warmth that seemed to reach something deep inside her chest. Because regardless of political complications or security concerns, I'm not leaving you to face the consequences of my gratitude alone. The promise in his voice was unmistakable, and it sent both comfort and terror through her system. Protection from someone with his obvious power was a gift beyond price, but that same protection would make her a target for anyone who saw her as a route to harming him. How long? She asked, understanding that resistance was not only futile, but potentially fatal. How long would this protective custody last? Until we've neutralized the threats that put you at risk, Thane replied. And until we've determined whether your knowledge can be contained without permanent measures. Permanent measures. The euphemism sent chills down her spine. But before she could ask for clarification, Kale spoke again. You have my word that no harm will come to you while you're under our protection, he said, his voice carrying the weight of formal promise. Whatever else happens, whatever political complications arise, you'll be safe. Safe from everyone except the people protecting me. Safe from everyone, including us. His amber eyes held hers with unwavering certainty. I owe you a life debt, Leora. That's not a small thing among our people. As she packed basic belongings under the watchful eyes of shifters whose true nature she was still struggling to accept, Leora couldn't shake the feeling that she was crossing a threshold from which there would be no return. 3 hours later, as their convoy of vehicles wound through mountain roads toward a destination she couldn't imagine, she caught Kyle watching her in the rearview mirror with an expression she couldn't interpret. Are you regretting helping me? He asked quietly. The question deserved consideration. A week ago, her biggest concern had been whether to ration her coffee supplies to last through the next supply run. Now she was traveling under armed escort toward the stronghold of the most feared pack in the Northern Territories, carrying knowledge that could apparently get her killed if it fell into the wrong hands. No, she said, surprised by her own certainty. I'm regretting that helping you turned out to be more complicated than either of us expected. Everything worthwhile is complicated, Kale replied. The question is whether the complications are worth whatever comes out of them. As they drove deeper into territory controlled by predators whose power she was only beginning to understand, Leora found herself hoping that whatever came out of her decision to save a dying wolf would prove worthy of the price she was apparently going to pay for it. because one thing was becoming increasingly clear. Her life as she'd known it was over, and what would replace it depended entirely on choices that were no longer entirely her own to make. The Ravarin fortress materialized from the mountainside, like something born from nightmares and ancient power. As their convoy approached the massive gates carved from black stone, Leora felt her breath catch at the sheer impossibility of what she was seeing. The structure rose in defiance of gravity and engineering logic, its towers spiraling toward the sky, with the organic curves of something grown rather than built. "It's magnificent," she whispered, pressed against the vehicle's window as they passed beneath an archway that could have accommodated aircraft. "It's home," Kyle said simply, but she caught the pride in his voice. "Built by 17 generations of my family, each adding their own interpretation of power and permanence. It looks like it grew out of the mountain itself. In many ways it did. The original structure was carved from natural caves and expanded outward as the pack grew. Each generation has added layers, creating something that's part fortress, part palace, part living organism." As they drove through courtyards that could have held armies and past training grounds where figures moved with inhuman speed and grace, Leora began to understand the scope of what she'd stumbled into. This wasn't just a pack. It was a civilization, complete with its own economy, military, and social structure. "How many people live here?" she asked. "The permanent population is around 3,000, Kale replied, though that number fluctuates based on seasonal migration patterns and political alliances. 3,000. An entire city hidden in the mountains, invisible to the human world but wielding power that apparently extended far beyond their physical boundaries." The scale of the secret that had been revealed to her was beginning to sink in, along with the implications of what knowing that secret might mean for her future. Their vehicle stopped before an entrance that managed to be both welcoming and intimidating. Carved doors 3 stories tall, flanked by guards whose casual alertness spoke of lethal capability held in check by discipline. As she followed Kale from the vehicle, Leora found herself the focus of dozens of curious gazes from passing pack members. "They're staring," she murmured, unconsciously moving closer to Kale's protective presence. "You're the first human to enter this fortress in living memory," he replied. "Of course they're curious. Am I safe here? Safer than anywhere else in the world?" His amber eyes met hers with unwavering certainty. "You're under my personal protection, which makes harming you equivalent to attacking the royal family directly. No one here would be foolish enough to risk that kind of retaliation." As they entered the fortress proper, Leora's attention was immediately captured by the impossible beauty of the interior spaces. What should have been dark, oppressive stone corridors were instead filled with warm light from sources she couldn't identify. Tapestries that looked ancient and priceless lined the walls, telling stories in images that seemed to move when viewed peripherally. And everywhere, the subtle signs of technology seamlessly integrated with traditional architecture in ways that spoke of wealth beyond imagination. "Your quarters," Kyle said, stopping before a door that looked like it belonged in a 5-star hotel rather than a mountain fortress. "I've arranged for you to have privacy while you adjust to the situation." The room beyond the door took her breath away. A sitting area with furniture that looked handcrafted by masters, a bedroom with a bed that could sleep 4 people comfortably, and windows that provided spectacular views of the valley below. It was luxury beyond anything she'd ever experienced, and it felt like the most beautiful prison cell ever designed. "This is temporary," she said, as much to convince herself as to seek confirmation from Kale. "That depends on how quickly we can resolve the security situation." His expression grew more serious. "Leora, I need you to understand something. The attack on me wasn't random violence. It was part of a larger political conflict that's been building for months. Until we identify and neutralize the people responsible, you're not safe anywhere outside these walls." "What kind of political conflict?" "The kind that involves people who think the old ways of ruling through fear and isolation have outlived their usefulness." Kyle moved to the window, his attention apparently focused on something beyond the distant mountains. "There are factions within shifter society who believe we should integrate with the human world rather than remaining hidden from it. Others believe that integration would mean the destruction of everything that makes us what we are." "And you believe what?" "I believe that change is inevitable, but that how we manage that change will determine whether our people survive it." He turned back to face her, his amber eyes holding depths that spoke of experiences she couldn't imagine. The attack on me was intended to destabilize my father's rule and create an opportunity for more radical factions to seize control. More radical how? The kind of radical that involves eliminating potential security threats rather than managing them. His tone was matter of fact, but the implication sent ice through her veins. Which is why your safety depends on us resolving this situation before those factions discover you exist. A knock at the door interrupted their conversation, and Cale's expression immediately shifted to alert wariness. "Enter," he called. "Doctor." Elena Voss entered carrying a medical bag and wearing an expression that suggested professional consultation rather than social visit. "Your Majesty," she said with a slight bow, "I wanted to check your recovery progress and ensure that travel hasn't aggravated your healing." "I'm fine," Kyle replied, though Leora could see the subtle tension in his posture that suggested otherwise. "With respect, that's my determination to make." Dr. Voss's tone brooked no argument despite the difference in their respective authority. "And I'd like Ms. Hale's input on the treatment protocol she used during the critical first days." "You want me to what?" Leora asked, surprised by the request. "I want to understand exactly what you did to keep him alive long enough for his natural healing to take effect." Dr. Voss moved to the sitting area, setting her medical bag on the low table between the chairs. "Shifter physiology is complex, and human medical knowledge typically isn't sufficient to treat our more severe injuries. The fact that your intervention was successful suggests either exceptional skill or extraordinary intuition. It was mostly improvisation based on veterinary training," Leora said, settling into one of the chairs. "I treated the wounds like I would for a large animal, focusing on stopping blood loss and preventing infection." "Show me." For the next hour, Leora found herself demonstrating the techniques she'd used to treat Cale's injuries, while Dr. Voss took detailed notes and asked questions that revealed a medical understanding far beyond anything human medicine had achieved. The examination revealed that Cale's recovery had been remarkably complete. Wounds that should have left permanent scars had healed without trace, and injuries that should have required surgical intervention had resolved through natural processes accelerated by whatever she'd done to stabilize his condition. "Extraordinary," Dr. Voss murmured, completing her examination. "Your intuitive understanding of trauma treatment is remarkable for someone without formal medical training. My father taught me field medicine because we lived in rural areas where professional veterinary care wasn't always available," Leora explained. "I learned to treat whatever injuries I encountered, regardless of species. That flexibility served the heir well." Dr. Voss packed her equipment with efficient movements. "Your willingness to adapt human medical knowledge to shifter physiology almost certainly saved his life." As the doctor prepared to leave, she paused at the door with an expression that suggested personal rather than professional concerns. "Ms. Hale," she said carefully, "I hope you understand how rare it is for our people to find humans who can be trusted with knowledge of our true nature. The fact that you're here, alive and unharmed, speaks to both the heir's confidence in your character and his father's willingness to take unprecedented risks for someone he's never met. What are you trying to tell me?" "I'm trying to help you understand that whatever happens next, you're no longer just someone who helped a stranger in need." Dr. Voss's dark eyes held depths that seemed to see far more than surface appearances. "You're someone whose actions have created bonds that extend far beyond simple gratitude." After the doctor departed, Leora found herself alone with Kyle in a silence that seemed heavy with unspoken implications. The formal consultation had revealed layers of complexity she hadn't considered, not just medical, but political and personal as well. "She's right, isn't she?" Leora asked finally. "About the bonds that have been created." "Yes." Cale's voice was quiet, but carried absolute certainty. "Among our people, life debts create obligations that transcend normal social relationships. By saving my life, you've established a connection that can't be severed by distance or time." "What kind of connection?" "The kind that means your well-being becomes my responsibility, and my protection becomes your right." His amber eyes met hers with intensity that made her pulse quicken. "It's not a burden you asked for, but it's not one that can be refused once established. And if I don't want that kind of connection, then you'll discover that wanting and having are often very different things." Cale moved closer, close enough that she could see flecks of gold in his amber eyes. "Leora, I need you to understand something. The moment you chose to save my life, rather than protecting yourself from potential danger, you changed the course of both our futures in ways that can't be undone. I was just helping someone who was hurt. You were choosing compassion over caution in a situation where that choice could have cost you everything." His voice dropped, becoming more personal despite the formal nature of their conversation. That kind of courage is extraordinarily rare, and it creates bonds that go deeper than political alliances or social obligations. Before Leora could ask what he meant by that cryptic statement, another knock at the door interrupted their conversation. This time, the visitor was Thane himself, carrying an authority that seemed to fill the room with dangerous potential. "Son," he said, his attention shifting between Kale and Leora with uncomfortable intensity. "I trust you're finding your accommodations satisfactory, Ms. Hale." "Very satisfactory, thank you." Leora rose from her chair, uncertain about protocol when dealing with someone whose power was absolute within his territory. "Though I have to admit, the luxury feels somewhat overwhelming. You'll adjust." Thane's smile was sharp with predatory satisfaction. "We've received intelligence that requires immediate attention. The people who attacked my son have been identified, and their plans extend far beyond simple assassination." "What kind of plans?" Kyle asked, his tone shifting to the professional alertness of someone accustomed to dealing with political threats. "The kind that involve using human authorities to destabilize our territory through exposure and investigation." Thane's expression grew darker. "They've been feeding information to federal agencies about our existence, our capabilities, and our influence over regional politics." The implications hit Leora like a physical blow. "They're trying to reveal your existence to the human world. More specifically, they're trying to reveal our existence in ways that will provoke hostile responses from human governments." Thane moved to the window, his attention apparently focused on the valley below. "Exposure as a threat to be eliminated rather than as a people to be negotiated with. Which means your safety has become even more complicated," Kale said, his attention returning to Leora with concern that seemed both professional and personal. "If our enemies discover that a human possesses intimate knowledge of our vulnerabilities, you become a target for information extraction that could compromise our entire defensive strategy. Or," Thane added with casual brutality, "you become a liability that needs to be eliminated before it can be exploited." The words hung in the air like a death sentence, and Leora felt her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack under the weight of implications she hadn't been prepared for. "What are my options?" she asked quietly. "You have two," Thane replied. "Accept permanent integration into our society under royal protection, or accept permanent isolation from the human world to prevent information leakage." "Permanent?" "The knowledge you possess can't be extracted from your memory, and the bonds you've formed can't be severed by time or distance." Thane's tone was matter-of-fact, as if discussing weather rather than life-altering decisions. "Which means your previous life has ended, regardless of what you choose to replace it with. And if I choose integration, then you accept the responsibilities and privileges that come with being under royal protection, including the obligation to support pack interests and the authority to influence decisions that affect our people's future." The offer was both generous and terrifying in its implications. To go from complete isolation to positions of influence within a civilization she was still learning existed, to trade her anonymous freedom for security backed by power she couldn't imagine. "What would that look like?" she asked. "It would look like learning our ways, contributing your skills to our collective welfare, and accepting that your individual desires must sometimes be subordinate to community needs." Kale's voice carried warmth that seemed to ease some of the terror that was paralyzing her. "But it would also look like being valued for your intelligence rather than tolerated despite it, being protected rather than abandoned when circumstances become difficult, and being part of something larger than individual survival. And the alternative? Comfortable isolation in a location where your knowledge can't be accessed by our enemies or used against our people." Thane's expression grew more serious. "A life of safety without purpose, security without connection. The choice should have been impossible to make. Everything she understood about human psychology, about the dangers of accepting offers that seemed too good to be true, screamed warnings about choosing integration with predators whose true nature she was still learning to understand. But as she looked around the beautiful room that had been prepared for her comfort, as she met the amber eyes of someone who had risked his position to protect her from the consequences of her compassion, as she considered the alternative of returning to the isolation that had been slowly killing her before she'd found a dying wolf in a snowstorm, the choice became remarkably clear. "Integration," she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was committing to. "I choose integration." "Are you certain?" Thane asked, though his expression suggested approval rather than surprise. "Once that choice is made, it can't be reversed. You'll become part of our people in ways that transcend legal or social relationships." "I'm certain." Leora looked directly at Kale, seeing something in his amber eyes that made her pulse quicken with recognition rather than fear. "I've been alone for most of my life. If I'm going to be bound to something larger than myself, I'd rather be bound to people who value courage and compassion than to institutions that see both as weaknesses." "Then welcome to the Raverin Pack," Thane said formally, his tone carrying the weight of ritual declaration. "May your integration bring strength to our people and purpose to your life." As the sun set beyond the mountain peaks, casting the fortress in shades of gold and crimson that made the ancient stones seem to glow with their own inner fire, Leora stood at her window and tried to process the transformation her life had undergone in a single week. A week ago, she'd been an isolated woman whose biggest concern had been rationing supplies through the winter. Now she was a pack member under royal protection, carrying knowledge that could reshape the relationship between human and shifter societies, bound by obligations and privileges that she was still learning to understand. "No regrets?" Kyle asked from the doorway, his voice carrying genuine concern about her emotional state. "Ask me again in a year," she replied, turning to meet his gaze with a smile that felt surprisingly genuine. "But right now, no regrets." "Good." His answering smile was brilliant and transformative, revealing depths of satisfaction that spoke of hopes he'd been afraid to acknowledge. "Because I have a feeling that your integration is going to change this place in ways none of us are prepared for." As night fell over the fortress, and Leora prepared for her first sleep as a member of the most feared pack in the Northern Territories, she couldn't shake the feeling that her simple act of mercy toward a dying wolf had set in motion changes that would ripple far beyond anything she could currently imagine. But for the first time in years, those changes felt like possibilities rather than threats. And that, she thought as sleep finally claimed her, was worth almost any risk. If you enjoyed this story, a like or comment really helps. And if you wish to hear more tales like this one, make sure you subscribe so you never miss the next tale.